The new bearings for the CT175 finally arrived. This is what I ended up with. Inside this box, they sent me a tube of grease to pack the bearings, 2 seals. These seals are the same, so it doesn't matter which one goes on top and which one goes on bottom. And then, of course, the top bearing and race and the bottom bearing and race. When I took these out of the package, I compared them to the old bearing and race. You remember, or maybe I mentioned in another video, that I like to keep all of the old material until I get the new stuff and compare it to. That way I know that it's going to be a good fit. If we look at these and we compare them, the bottom bearing is stamped 30 by 48 by 13. Now those measurements represent 30 is the inside diameter of this bearing, 48 is the outside diameter of this race, and 13 is the height of this setup. When I compare the new to the old, everything is a perfect match. The height, the diameters here, outside and inside. So that one I'm very happy with. The top is stamped 25 by 43 by 11. 25 millimeters is this. 43 is the outside measurement of this, and 11 is the height of the bearing race. When I compare the new to the old, the new actually sits a little bit proud or above the old. I'd say it's probably a millimeter, maybe a millimeter and a half. Doesn't seem like much, and I'm hoping that it doesn't create a problem for me sometime down the road during assembly. When you look at these bearings and races, just to give you some idea of what those measurements correspond to, the inside measurement of the top, we'll switch these around so they're a little better oriented. The inside measurement of this top bearing corresponds to the diameter of the stem right here. The inside measurement of the bottom bearing corresponds to this little raised portion right there. When these go together, the bearings will sit on here like so. Of course, this seal will go first. So we'll have this new seal, the new bearing, and of course it will be greased up and ready to go. Then on the top portion, we'll have this new bearing along with the new seal. Now, when this all goes back together, this new top bearing will be the last piece that's installed. These races will sit inside the frame. So we have our bottom race. This bottom race is going to sit like so. So the taper points outward and down. The top race will sit like so inside the frame. And that taper will face up and out. And then the bearings will sit inside of those when we assemble everything. Just for reference, this center measurement here and this center measurement here represents the inside diameter of those portions that hold the race. As I mentioned, the top bearing and race is just slightly taller than the old original equipment. And my only concern when I put this together is if I have extra space when I assemble this. Here is the headlight mount, and if this distance that normally is a snug fit right here where the fork goes through and holds this bracket, if that changes and increases, I'll have some extra space in here that I'm going to have to contend with. I may end up having to put an extra rubber washer in there just to snug things up. If I don't take up that space, the headlight and the bracket will rattle when I'm riding the motorcycle, and I don't want that. But we'll see how things go together when we get to the assembly. We're going to reassemble the steering stem and the triple clamp today. First thing I'm going to do is just get an idea of how far these races have to seat inside the column. So I'm just going to use a caliper, and you really don't even need to do this. You could just use some other type of measuring device. In fact, I'm not even going to turn it on. What I'm interested in is the depth of this column here where the bearing sits, and mostly just because I'm unfamiliar with this, and with this top set there's a little bit of a discrepancy as far as how deep that's going to seat. Now it looks to me like this bottom is at least going to go in all the way, and probably going to have to sit inside of that column just a little bit, so this will be proud of the race. On this side we've got the race that I can tell just by the way things are going that it's going to stick out a little bit. So that's my depth. I'm going to have the race that's sticking out. Because that is going to stick out, I'm going to take a Sharpie and just draw myself a little reference point here on this race so that I know roughly when it's seated. And while I'm at it, I'll put it on a couple of sides here. That'll just give me an idea when I've kind of bottomed out and I don't need to keep pushing it in. So a view of the top here and the race. Now this race is going to go in so that it tapers out, and the bearing will sit down inside of there. So the first thing I'm going to do is just try and get this started. Now this side of the race here, I do not want to bugger up there. The bottom side is kind of a surface that you can use to tap and when you drive these out. So that's not real critical there, but I'm going to use a couple of real soft tools here just to kind of get it started. And the idea is to make sure that you're tapping it in evenly all the way around. You don't want to hit one side in and bury it with the other side sticking out, otherwise you may bend or even break these races. So I'm just going around and just looking down from my angle, you know, it's going in pretty smoothly. It's getting a little bit tight. So I'm going to actually use a real hammer to finish driving this in, but I'm not actually going to hit that race with the hammer. I'm going to use a block of wood, kind of give it a buffer. This way I'll really be able to put some force on it. And again, I'm moving from side to side, top to bottom. Now as I look around that looks really good. I had my reference mark right there and I could just barely see it down inside of there. So that looks really good. Even when I look inside on this resting surface, everything looks good. This bottom race, originally I had thought that it was going to sit in this outside ring here on this column, but there's actually a step right here where the bearing race is going to sit. Now I'm going to give myself just a couple of easy reference marks. What I've done is I've measured the actual thickness of this race, and this is 10 millimeters, and I'm going to subtract that 10 millimeters away from this total distance here, which is 16.62. So we'll bring this down to roughly 6.62, and then I'm just going to use this to give myself a couple of reference marks in here, so I kind of know when I've bottomed out. I don't think that that's going to be too difficult to tell just visually, but I want to make sure that I get it in there all the way. You could go crazy trying to get all accurate in there and making sure that those marks are exactly where they need to be, but if you're driving this in straight like you're supposed to, theoretically when you get it seated, all of those reference marks are roughly going to be where they need to show up. Now the one thing about this race, when I put this in, first off I want to make sure that I get it in right. So this taper is out and down like so. Here's the large surface, here's the smaller surface. And I'm going to start putting this in here, and I realized real quickly that I don't have much surface to drive this in. I'm not going to be able to hit it with a hammer or a block. So sometimes desperation kind of breeds creativity. What I've got here, this is just a piece of chain link fence post, but this happens to fit right in here, not snug. I don't want it to get locked up in there, but it's going to sit on the face of this bearing race and force it in evenly. So I'll drive with a hammer, I'll pound on this post and drive that in all the way. Bottom race is seated. You can see in here that I've got my reference marks, and that's roughly where I was going. There's nothing super accurate about that, but ultimately what I'm trying to do back here on this surface, that's the final resting position of this race. And I'll tell you, just looking at that race, you want to make sure that you get that thing in right, because there's actually no surface for you to come down through if you ever have to change these to pop that out. So make sure you don't bugger it up, and make sure you get it in there the right orientation. So I've looked around this entire circumference of this ring, and it's made contact the whole way. So the steering column and the triple clamp, I'm starting to put those back together. I put the steering dampener on. Most of the old stuff I'm just chucking, the old ball bearings. However, I am going to keep this original seal because this isn't going to get in the way of any of the new stuff, and probably should be here anyway. And that's why I save everything that's old. That goes in, there's a slight groove that goes down. Then one of the dust seals that comes with the kit goes next. And then the bottom bearing here is going to go down, and you're just going to kind of start to seat that. That's going to be a pretty snug fit right there. I removed the steering stabilizer because I've got to put a little force on this bearing to at least get it started. When I put this whole thing together and I crimp down on that nut on the top, it'll pull everything and finish seating everything, but I've got to get this started, and I don't want to smack that steering stabilizer around. Just taking a piece of pipe here. This is a piece of chain link top rail, and just going to give this some light taps equally. Drive that down. Not taking much force. So when sliding this steering stem in, I want to make sure that on this steering dampener I get this notch here on the tab that's part of the frame. Now we just take our top bearing. That's going to go down in there. And there is another dust seal that's going to sit on top of that. And this is the original cap that sits down on here, like so. That covers that. And then this is the final nut that goes on there. And once we get this started, making sure that all my seals and everything's lining up, don't want anything to get pinched. I actually looked at some earlier video footage, and that camphor or bevel actually goes up, so this is in the correct position now. I'm going to get a tool and tighten this whole setup down. It's going to help seat those bearings and those races, and I'll over tighten it and then I'll back it off just a little bit to where I want the tension.